In the closing months of the Second World War, the British re-established their control in Greece. They backed a government in which the Greek resistance, Eam Elas, had virtually no power in spite of the fact that it ran 4/5 of Greece and had widespread support. The British attitude had led to armed conflict with Elas in the streets of Athens. After 6 weeks fighting, British troops crushed the Greek resistance movement. But the amnesty which had been promised never took place. The result was a 2-year drift into civil war. Under the Varkisar Agreement, signed in February 1945, the communist-led Elas surrendered its arms. The Greek government was committed to an amnesty for political crimes and to removing from the police force all those Greeks who had collaborated with the Germans. But the purge of collaborators did not take place, and instead of an amnesty, the Elas partisans faced mass arrest. In the mountain villages, right-wing gangs began to terrorize anyone suspected of having been in the wartime resistance.
Some people on our side, the left, also did some extreme things. It's true that they executed some people. The Communist Party was still functioning legally after the Varkisar Agreement, but it did so in this state of terror.
What we saw in Greece in 1945 and 1946 was a gradual oppression of the left and all those thought sympathetic to the left by the right wing. The right wing, being in power, used its power as the gendarmerie was formed and the National Guard was formed to ensure that the membership of the gendarmerie and National Guard was sympathetic to the right rather than the left. And increasingly the left, which embraced a broader and broader spectrum of the population, was discriminated against.
Κυβερνήσεις των Άγγλων, έτσι τους λέμε, άρχισαν να παίρνουν έκτακτα μέτρα.
The governments of the English, that's what we call them. They started taking emergency measures. They suspended articles of the Constitution on civil rights.
Ειδικά μέτρα, έκτακτα μέτρα.
They introduced new decrees and special measures, which meant that the hundreds of former partisans who were arrested could end up going straight to court and then to be executed.
There were thousands of men and women in prison and exiled. Hundreds of men were executed or condemned to death for nothing. The only accusation was that they had belonged to Elas. It was the English who were in charge of this whole business.
Meanwhile, in Greece, the government did little to halt the right-wing backlash. By now, 80,000 former Elas partisans were in prison.
People who have fought in the resistance were leaving their homes, going to other towns, in the hope of escaping the right-wing gangs who were after them. Others went to the mountains. Gradually their numbers grew until about 40,000 people were up in the mountains and began to form into defense groups. And from then on, when the army of the police or the right-wing terrorist gangs appeared, they armed themselves with guns to defend themselves.
The Communist Party, under its leader Zachariadis, swung from one policy to another. They threatened to retaliate against right-wing violence, and at the same time they called for a more representative government. Bevin insisted that the Greek government should hold elections.
Εδώ πάλι πρέπει να πούμε ότι όταν ρωτήθηκαν.
When we asked the communist parties for their opinion on what we should do about the election, the Soviet Union, which was the most powerful, said we should take part.
Απάντησε ότι πρέπει να πάρουμε μέρος στις εκλογές.
Zachariadis decided then to do the opposite, just what the reactionaries were hoping.
In spite of this advice, the Communist Party leadership decided to abstain on the grounds that the election could not possibly be a fair one.
I think the leadership of the left fell into a trap. I think it was a mistake to abstain from the elections in 1946. despite the climate of terror and the daily
areas as trade unions, foreign trade, the fiscal policy of the Greek state, conditions in prisons, the salaries of civil servants, even Social Security was really controlled by American officials. Obviously, in the military sector, the control was very, very thorough because the Americans provided not only the equipment but also the economic support for the armed forces, and therefore the Americans had a veto over anything that had to do with the Greek armed forces.
Well, the Greek guerrilla effort, which originally we estimated around 7,000 and which never got over 20, was obviously a minority which had been organized and directed from bases in Yugoslavia and Albania and Bulgaria. It was not an indigenous Greek organization. It was the appendage of a communist organization.
Η βοήθεια στο Δημοκρατικό στρατό τώρα ήταν βέβαια ελάχιστη και φυσικά
the aid the partisan army got was minimal. Of course, it was better than nothing.
Throughout this period, there had been a long tactical argument on the partisan side between the army chief, Markos Vafiadis, who favored a guerrilla war, and the Communist Party leader, Zachariadis, who wanted the partisans to switch to conventional tactics. Zachariadis won.
Εμένα τον Αύγουστο με καθαίρεσαν από την ηγεσία.
In August, I was expelled from the leadership because we had been arguing since 1947 about partisan strategy and tactics.
Και η διαφωνία μας βασικά ήταν αυτή. Η στρατηγική η τακτική μας ποια θα πρέπει να είναι.
Zachariadis kept insisting that we were an army and so should adopt conventional army tactics.
Θα πρέπει να
And he was saying that at a time when we didn't even have a place to rest our heads. I took the opposite view, that we were a partisan army and that one day we might become a regular army, but at that time we certainly weren't. That was our difference.
Αυτή ήταν η διαφορά μας.
Για μένα, κακώς. Για μένα δηλαδή προσωπικά το λέω.
I think the leadership handled this issue very badly. It happened while we were right in the midst of the struggle. It really shouldn't have happened. And I think it was one of the main reasons why we were defeated later.
In the daytime, we rested and slept. As soon as it got dark, we went down the mountain and worked through the night building defenses. One evening, we'd gone to camouflage them, and an officer came and told us to go back up the mountain. We did. And as daylight broke, the smoke and the bombs started. Bam, boom, smoke everywhere. Virgin Mary. Airplanes, artillery, shells, mitrailleurs, automatic weapons. It was the end of the world. The end of the world. The partisans had mined the river, and as soon as the government army crossed it, the mines went off. The mountain erupted. The whole mountain was trembling. There was smoke and fire everywhere. The partisans were crossing the river with knives between their teeth. They'd go to the machine gun positions and attack. But the government soldiers kept returning with reinforcements.
Things were so bad we had to keep a sense of humor. For instance, the reconnaissance plane that always came very early in the morning, we nicknamed the milkman. The next plane, we call it the barrel plane, because it dropped barrels full of napalm, which set the whole area on fire.
There were 17,000 casualties in Operation Summit. For the government army, it was a strategic failure. But at the United Nations, the Greek government claimed the children were being forcibly separated from their parents so they could be brought up as devout communists.
I had a small girl. We were fired on from the mountains with artillery, and the soldiers accused us of hiding partisans. It was treachery. We were supposed to have done this or that. We didn't know what was going on. People were butchered right here, in the village square, and the children saw it all. The partisans were forced to form a committee, to take the children away from here. The children left because they were terrified of the planes. Our village was bombarded. I had great difficulty finding the children in the evenings. They'd fled wherever they could. I was hiding in the fields myself. The children wanted to leave. My eldest daughter wanted to go, but I wouldn't let her. What would I have done all alone? 170 children left. They went past Marcos and began to sing. We were laughing and crying at the same time. We cried to see so many children leaving. The village was deserted. There was not a single child to help the priest in church.
In 1949, there were still about 20,000 armed partisans, 1 in 5 of whom were women. The government army had 263,000 soldiers, backed by American advisors and officers of the newly formed CIA.
We helped carry the stretchers. To tell you the truth, we had no bread. We were so hungry. It was very foggy and pouring with rain. And we were told to go and collect an injured government army officer who was still alive. But as we approached him, what happened? He started to fire at us. The officer, firing at us. I was with 2 partisan women, one of whom was called Flora. We decided to lie down. But the officer still kept firing at us. So we threw stones at him. 2 of us had Bren guns. It was such a muddle in all the folk. Government soldiers on one side of us, partisans on the other. Then another soldier went up to the officer. He was Flora's brother. And then she saw him. She called him, and he recognized her voice and shouted, "Flora." And just as he shouted her name, the wounded officer shot him. He killed Flora's brother. You should have seen her. She threw herself on the officer. We killed him. We tore him to pieces. He was a huge man. Then we left the place, and we took Flora's brother with us, even though he was in the government army, and we buried him. It was night time. We always walked at night, because in the day we would get fired at. Finally, we reached the Albanian border. The army was advancing, our brothers from one side and from the other. I had brothers in the government army fighting against us. We didn't know what to do. We had no choice.
They managed to capture us all together, because of course they had the arms, tanks, planes, everything, while we didn't have even a tank. It was true that we had no shelter at all. We were on our own. And it was our leadership's fault, because they had made us all gather in Vitsi and Gramos. That's why we were defeated and had to cross over into the People's Republics.
In Athens, the government celebrated its victory. But 100,000 Greeks had died in the civil war. The left had lost. Its supporters in Greece were in prison, and those who fled abroad were to spend the next 30 years in exile.
The civil war was fought for democracy. But there are people who are greedy. Let them burst from their greed. Democracy will come one day.